The letter of James includes one of the most controversial passages in the whole Bible, chapter 2, verse 24. The reason for the controversy is its seeming contradiction of Paul's teaching on justification. And being that this is one of the most foundational doctrines of the faith, it's pretty significant if two New Testament authors appear to disagree. Justification, remember, is a legal declaration that a person is in the right or righteous. And how does a person obtain this declaration? Well, at first glance, Paul and James seem to contradict one another. In 2 verse 24, James writes, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone." This looks like the very opposite of what Paul says about justification in Romans 3:28. "For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law." To make sense of what these two authors are saying and whether or not they agree, let's break the issue down into two questions. One, in James 2:24, is James responding directly to what Paul writes in Romans and also writes about similarly in Galatians? And two, does James disagree with Paul about the basis for our justification? The first question, is James responding directly to Paul's teaching on justification in Romans and Galatians? On initial reading, their use of language appears almost identical, so it looks like James is using Paul's words to respond directly to him. However, a careful look at both texts evidences key differences in their word choices. Significantly, Paul writes of works of the law, whereas James writes simply of works. When you examine the broader context of both letters, it becomes clear that these are two different things. When Paul writes that works of the law have no part in justification, he does so in the context of defending Gentile inclusion in the people of God without circumcision and outside of observance to the law, and thus purely on the basis of faith in the work of Christ. But when James writes of works, he is referring more generally to good deeds, which he sees as a necessary expression of a true and saving faith in the work of Christ. So the fact that Paul and James are referring to two different things when they refer to works makes it unlikely that James is directly responding to Paul, although he may be responding to people who have read and misunderstood Paul. The second question was whether or not James and Paul fundamentally disagree on the basis of our justification. Again, carefully looking at the language of both authors helps us answer this. Notice, only James uses the qualifier alone. He writes, "A person is justified by works and not by faith alone." Said another way, a person is justified by works and not by a faith that exists alone. Or, even more loosely, if you have a faith that is not accompanied by good deeds, that faith is useless, dead, and will not justify you before God. A faith that is alone without expressing itself in good deeds is merely intellectual assent, much like the kind of faith that demons have that God exists. This is not the faith that the New Testament asserts is the basis for our justification, and Paul would agree. Like James, Paul would expect a person's faith to naturally produce good works, empowered by God's Spirit, which is clear even in Romans from the kind of transformation he expects to see in the lives of believers. Paul's point in Romans 3 is not that faith and good works are mutually exclusive, but that the righteousness that comes by faith is distinct from the righteousness that comes by perfect obedience to the law, which is a righteousness that no human being can attain anyway. Thus, the righteousness by faith is purely a gift. James and Paul would both agree that good works should be evident in the life of a person who has faith in Jesus, which they both got from Jesus himself. In Matthew 7:21, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' or who has faith, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Doing the will of God is the natural outflow of a faith that trusts in God alone for our justification, and not in any good work that we can do in our own strength. Nothing we do can get God to love us more than he already does. No good work can prove to him that we deserve to be declared righteous. But the kind of faith that looks only to God for this declaration always expresses itself in faithful obedience. Good works are simply the natural fruit that true faith produces.